May 6, 1937. It is a date carved in fire into the history books. Before that day, the future of flight was not airplanes. It was giant, majestic airships that sailed silently through the clouds like ocean liners in the sky. They were symbols of luxury, technological prowess, and national pride. The greatest of them all was the LZ-129 Hindenburg. It was a marvel of engineering, a floating palace longer than 3 Boeing 747s placed end to end. But in just 37 terrifying seconds over a rainy field in New Jersey, that dream turned into a nightmare. The world watched, and more importantly heard, as the pride of Nazi Germany became a spectacular inferno, killing 36 people and ending the age of the dirigible forever. This is not just a story about a crash. It is a story about hubris, politics, the dangerous beauty of hydrogen, and the exact moment the world lost its innocence about the safety of the skies. This is the story of the Hindenburg. To understand the tragedy, you must first understand the magnificence of the machine. The Hindenburg was not just an airship, it was a statement. Built by the Zeppelin company in Friedrichshafen, Germany, it was the largest aircraft ever to fly. Imagine an object in the sky that is 804 feet long. That is only slightly smaller than the Titanic. Its metal skeleton was made of duralumin, a lightweight aluminum alloy covered by a massive fabric skin painted silver to reflect the sun's heat. Inside this colossal envelope were 16 enormous cotton gas cells. These cells were the lungs of the ship, and they were filled with the most abundant, the lightest, and the most dangerously flammable elements in the universe: hydrogen. The original plan was to use helium. Helium is safe, it does not burn. But in the 1930s, the United States had a monopoly on the world's helium supply. Growing suspicious of the rising Nazi regime in Germany, the U.S. refused to sell helium to the Zeppelin company. The German engineers had no choice. They had to use hydrogen. They knew the risks. They knew they were flying a potential bomb. But German engineering was arrogant. They believed their safety measures were foolproof. They believed they could tame the dragon. For the passengers, the Hindenburg was the epitome of luxury travel. It was faster than an ocean liner and smoother than a train. A one-way ticket across the Atlantic cost about $400 in 1937 money, roughly $7,000 today. The passenger decks were located inside the belly of the airship. There were comfortable sleeping cabins for up to 70 people. There was a dining room where gourmet meals were served on fine china with silverware. There was a lounge with a lightweight aluminum grand piano. There were enormous slanted windows along the promenade decks, allowing passengers to look down at the ocean or the cities passing thousands of feet below. Perhaps the most daring feature of all was the smoking room. On a ship filled with 7 million cubic feet of explosive hydrogen, a smoking room seemed like madness. But it was a marvel of safety engineering. It was a pressurized chamber, separated from the rest of the ship by an airlock. The only lighter on board was chained to a table inside this room, watched over by a steward. No one was allowed to bring matches or lighters aboard. The pressure inside the room was kept higher than the outside, so if the door was opened, air would rush out, preventing any hydrogen from rushing in. It was the safest, dangerous room on Earth. The Hindenburg was more than just a luxury liner. It was a propaganda tool for Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. The Zeppelin company was proud of its heritage, but the Nazi government controlled the funding. Huge, bright red swastika flags were painted on the vertical tail fins of the Hindenburg. Wherever the massive ship flew, over the stadiums of the 1936 Berlin Olympics or over the skyscrapers of New York City, the symbol of the Third Reich cast a shadow on the ground below. For the American audience watching it arrive, it was a complicated sight. It was a technological wonder, yes, but it also represented a regime that was becoming increasingly threatening on the world stage. Despite the politics, the Hindenburg had a flawless safety record. In its first year of service, 1936, It had flown thousands of miles, crossed the North Atlantic 10 times to the United States, and crossed the South Atlantic 7 times to Brazil. It had carried over 1,000 passengers without a single injury. The crew, led by the experienced Captain Max Pruss, was highly trained. They were the best airshipmen in the world. Confidence was high. The hydrogen was dangerous, they admitted, but the Zeppelin was safe. On the evening of May 3, 1937, the Hindenburg departed from Frankfurt, Germany for its first North American trip of the season. It was a routine flight. On board were 97 people, 36 passengers and 61 crew members. The passengers were a mix of wealthy businessmen, journalists, and families returning home. Among them was the acrobat Joseph Spa, who was traveling with his dog Ula. There was the donor family with their 3 young children returning to Mexico. There was Colonel Nelson Morris, an American businessman, bringing home samples of fine wines. The journey across the Atlantic was mostly smooth, though they encountered strong headwinds that slowed their progress. Life on board was tranquil. The passengers ate elaborate meals, drank cocktails in the smoking room, wrote postcards to loved ones, and marveled at the view of icebergs floating in the ocean below. Below decks, the crew worked tirelessly. The riggers climbed through the complex skeleton of the ship, checking the gas cells for leaks. The mechanics tended to the 4 massive diesel engines mounted in exterior pods called gondolas. The electricians monitored the complex wiring that ran the length of the ship. It was a delicate balance. As the ship burned fuel, it became lighter and wanted to rise. To keep it at the correct altitude, the captain had to vent precious hydrogen. If it became too heavy due to rain or ice, they had to drop water ballast. Flying an airship was an art form, a constant dance with gravity and buoyancy. By the afternoon of May 6, the Hindenburg reached the American coastline. It flew over Boston and then headed south toward New York City. Captain Pruss, knowing
the destination was the Naval Air Station at Lakehurst, New Jersey, located in the middle of the Pine Barrens. This was the primary American port for the great airships. A massive hangar, big enough to house the Hindenburg, dominated the landscape. A tall mooring mast stood ready in the center of the landing field. By late afternoon, a severe thunderstorm rolled over Lakehurst. Lightning cracked the sky, and heavy rain drenched the sandy airfield. Up in the Hindenburg, Captain Pruss received the weather reports. Landing a giant airship in a thunderstorm was suicidal. The wind could smash the delicate structure against the ground, and lightning was a terrifying threat to a hydrogen-filled vessel. Pruss made the sensible decision. He would not attempt to land. Instead, he turned the giant ship towards the coast to wait out the storm. For several hours, the Hindenburg circled over the beaches of New Jersey, a silent gray ghost waiting for the sky to clear. On board, the mood shifted from excitement to frustration. The passengers were tired. They wanted to land. They had missed their train connections. Dinner was served early to pacify them. On the ground at Lakehurst, the landing team waited in the soaking rain. Hundreds of sailors and civilian workers were needed to grab the thick landing ropes and physically pull the giant ship down to the mooring mast. Also waiting in the rain were reporters, photographers, and radio broadcasters. Among them was a young reporter from Chicago named Herbert Morrison, working for radio station WLAS. He was there to record a routine landing for a delayed broadcast. He had no idea that he was about to record the most famous and most horrific piece of audio in broadcasting history. Around 6 p.m., the skies over Lakehurst began to clear. The rain stopped, though the air remained heavy and humid. The wind shift was tricky, but passable. Charles Rosendahl, the commander of the Lakehurst Naval Air Station, sent a radio message to Captain Pruss. Conditions now favorable for landing. Up in the airship, Captain Pruss received the message. He turned the great silver nose of the Hindenburg back toward Lakehurst. The long wait was over. The final approach had begun. The time was 7 p.m. The air over Lakehurst had cooled after the rain, but it was thick with humidity and highly charged with static electricity from the passing thunderstorm. On the ground, the puddles reflected the twilight. Up in the control gondola of the Hindenburg, Captain Max Pruss was focused. Landing this behemoth required absolute precision. The wind was coming from the southeast at about 6 knots. To land, an airship must face exactly into the wind, like a fish facing upstream in a river. To align the ship with the wind and the mooring mast, Pruss ordered a sharp turn to port, left, followed by a sharp turn to starboard, right. It was a tight S-turn, an aggressive maneuver for such a large vessel. The massive tail fins swung through the air. The duralumin skeleton of the ship groaned under the stress of the turn. Some historians believe this was the moment the fate of the Hindenburg was sealed. The stress of that sharp turn may have snapped a bracing wire inside the tail section. Like a whip cracking, the broken wire may have lashed out and sliced open one of the gigantic gas cells, specifically gas cell number 4 near the rear fin. If that happened, invisible, odorless, highly flammable hydrogen began silently leaking into the space between the gas cell and the outer fabric skin of the ship. The tail of the Hindenburg was slowly becoming a massive bomb, waiting for a fuse. At 7:21 p.m., the Hindenburg was hovering about 200 feet above the airfield. The engines were thrown into reverse to slow its forward momentum. "Down ropes!" came the command. From the nose of the ship, 2 heavy manila landing ropes were dropped. They uncoiled like giant snakes and hit the wet sandy ground with a heavy thud. The ground crew, soaked to the bone, ran forward and grabbed the ropes. They began to physically pull the 240-ton airship down toward the mooring mast. From the outside, it looked like a perfect textbook landing. The passengers crowded the observation windows, waving to the people below. They were minutes away from stepping onto American soil. No one knows for sure what happened next, but the most widely accepted theory involves an invisible killer: static electricity. The airship had been flying through a highly charged atmosphere for hours. Its massive metal frame and fabric skin had accumulated a huge electrical charge. As long as the ship was in the air, insulated from the ground, this charge had nowhere to go. But the moment the wet landing ropes hit the wet ground, the ship was grounded. The electrical charge in the metal frame rushed down the ropes into the earth. However, the outer fabric skin of the ship was less conductive than the metal frame. It held on to its charge longer. This created a difference in electrical potential between the outer skin and the internal metal skeleton. The theory is that right near the tail, where hydrogen was likely leaking and mixing with the air, a spark jumped. It was a tiny spark, like the one you feel when you touch a doorknob after walking on carpet. But in that hydrogen-rich environment, a tiny spark was all it took. At 7:25 p.m., a few witnesses on the ground noticed something strange on top of the airship, near the upper vertical fin. One witness described it as a fluttering of the fabric, as if gas was pushing against it. Another saw a faint blue glow, the eerie light of St. Elmo, dancing along the top ridge of the ship. Then there was a small puff of flame. It looked almost insignificant at first, a tiny mushroom of fire bright against the gray evening sky. A shudder ran through the giant ship. A deep, muffled boom echoed across the airfield, not a sharp crack, but a low, resonant sound like a shotgun fired inside a barrel. The hydrogen had ignited. On the ground, reporter Herbert Morrison was holding his microphone, casually describing the landing for his delayed broadcast. "The ropes have been dropped, and they've been taken hold of by a number of men. It's starting to rain again. The rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from..." Suddenly, his voice changed. It jumped an octave, filled with raw, unfiltered terror. "It's burst into flames! Get this, Charlie! Get this, Charlie! It's fire, and it's crashing! It's crashing terrible! Oh my! Get out of the way, please! It's burning and bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks agree that this is terrible! This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world!" The scene he was describing was apocalyptic. The fire on the tail spread with unimaginable speed. The hydrogen cells were not just burning, they were exploding in sequence, ripping the fabric.
The buoyancy in the tail vanished in a second. The stern of the ship, now a flaming skeleton, crashed heavily onto the airfield. The force of the impact snapped the ship's back. Morrison continued to broadcast, sobbing openly into the microphone, his professionalism completely shattered by the horror in front of him. "It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. It's smoke and it's in flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. Oh, the humanity and all the passengers screaming around here." His words, "Oh, the humanity," would become the defining lament of the 20th century, a cry of despair at the destructive power of technology gone wrong. Inside the Hindenburg, the world turned upside down in an instant. When the tail hit the ground, the nose of the ship was still buoyant. The entire 800-foot structure tilted violently upward at a horrifying 45-degree angle. In the dining room and lounge, chaos erupted. The sudden tilt sent furniture, plates, glassware, and passengers sliding down the polished floor toward the forward wall. People tumbled over each other in a heap of screaming humanity. The fire roared overhead. The fabric ceiling of the passenger decks began to melt and burn away, revealing the inferno of the hydrogen cells above them. Molten aluminum and burning fabric began to rain down on the people below. For those inside, it was a desperate race against time and gravity. The ship was falling fast, but it was also burning furiously. Some passengers, driven by panic, smashed the slanted observation windows and jumped. They were still too high. They hit the sandy ground with bone-shattering force. Others showed incredible presence of mind. Acrobats are trained to know where their bodies are in space. Joseph Spey, the vaudeville acrobat, realized that jumping too soon meant death. As the ship tilted, he grabbed onto a window frame and hung on outside the ship, dangling in the air. He waited. He watched the ground rushing up to meet him. When the burning wreckage was about 20 feet from the ground, he let go. He tumbled when he hit the sand, rolling away from the flames, suffering only a broken ankle. In the control gondola, Captain Pruss and his officers were heroes. As the ship turned into a falling torch, they didn't try to save themselves immediately. They stayed at their posts, trying to keep the nose of the ship level for as long as possible, trying to buy precious seconds for the passengers behind them to escape. When the control car finally smashed into the ground, Pruss was badly burned, but he survived. The heat on the ground was intense. The ground crew, who seconds earlier had been pulling the ropes, fled for their lives as the burning mountain of metal and fabric collapsed on top of them. The fuel tanks for the diesel engines burst, adding thick, black, oily smoke to the hydrogen flames. From the moment the first spark was seen on the tail to the moment the entire burning wreckage settled on the ground, exactly 37 seconds had passed. 37 seconds! That was all it took for the greatest flying machine ever built to be reduced to a smoldering pile of twisted metal and ashes. Silence fell over the airfield, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the screams of the survivors.
The silence that followed the crash lasted only a heartbeat. It was broken by the screams of the burn victims and the shouts of the rescuers. The initial instinct of the ground crew at Lakehurst, the sailors and civilians who had been holding the ropes, was to run away from the falling mountain of fire. It was a natural human reaction. But almost immediately, something remarkable happened. They stopped, they turned around, and they ran back toward the inferno. The heat was intense enough to blister skin from 50 feet away, Yet these men plunged into the smoke and wreckage, pulling survivors from the twisted duralumin frame. They found passengers wandering dazed on the airfield, their clothes burned off, their skin blackened. They found crew members trapped under girders. Captain Pruss, despite severe burns to his face and arms, helped carry his injured radio operator to safety before collapsing. Another captain on board, Ernst Lehmann, a senior Zeppelin executive flying as an observer, staggered out of the wreckage with his back on fire. He would die the next day in the hospital, muttering, "I don't understand, I don't understand." The rescue effort was chaotic but heroic. Marines, sailors, and civilians worked side by side, using sand to smother flames on people's bodies. They loaded the wounded into cars and trucks, turning the quiet naval base into a frantic triage center. Miraculously, out of the 97 people on board, 62 survived. Many were terribly injured, but they were alive. It seemed impossible that anyone could have walked away from such a complete devastation. Sadly, 35 people on the airship perished, 13 passengers and 22 crewmen. One civilian member of the ground crew, Alan Hageman, was also killed when the burning tail section crushed him. The final death toll was 36. Among the dead were the entire donor family, except for the mother and one son. As night fell over Lakehurst, the majestic silver ship was gone. All that remained was a blackened, skeletal cage of metal, glowing red in the darkness, smoking against the rain-soaked ground. Almost before the fires were out, the questions began. How could the safest aircraft in the world destroy itself in 37 seconds? The political stakes were enormous. Nazi Germany was embarrassed and suspicious. The Gestapo immediately suspected sabotage. Was it a bomb planted by anti-Nazi activists? Was it an American plot? In the United States, the FBI launched its own investigation. They interviewed every survivor, every member of the ground crew. They looked for evidence of a timer or a detonator or a gunshot that might have pierced a gas cell. Despite intense searching and wild theories, no hard evidence of sabotage was ever found. No bomb fragments, no suspicious passengers with a motive. The investigation commissions from both Germany and the United States eventually converged on the most probable scientific explanation, the one discussed in Part 2. The verdict was that the disaster was an act of God, a tragic combination of circumstances. The sharp turn likely caused a bracing wire to snap, puncturing a gas cell. Hydrogen leaked into the space under the fabric skin, mixing with the air to create an explosive cocktail. The highly charged atmosphere from the thunderstorm, combined with the wet landing ropes grounding the ship's frame, created a differential in electrical potential. A tiny static spark ignited the leaking hydrogen, and physics took over. It was a mundane, horrifying explanation. It wasn't a villain with a bomb. It was the inherent danger of the technology itself. The crash of the Hindenburg was not the deadliest airship disaster in history. The British airship R-101 had crashed in 1930, killing 48 people. The American Navy airship USS Akron had crashed into the ocean in 1933, killing 73 people. But the Hindenburg was different. It was different because the world saw it happen. There were newsreel cameras at Lakehurst that day. They captured the entire horrifying sequence on film. The explosion, the fire, the people falling. Within days, these images were shown in movie theaters across America and the world. Millions of people saw people burning alive on a giant screen. And there was Herb Morrison's radio broadcast. His sobbing, raw, emotional reporting brought the horror directly into their living rooms. Before the Hindenburg, airship travel was seen as glamorous and safe.
After the Hindenburg, it was seen as terrifying. The image of the burning Zeppelin became seared into the public consciousness. The confidence of the ticket-buying public evaporated overnight. No one wanted to fly sitting under millions of cubic feet of explosive gas. The Zeppelin company tried to recover. They built a sister ship, the Graf Zeppelin II, but it never carried paying passengers on intercontinental flights. The dream was dead. The age of the giant rigid airship, which had begun at the turn of the century, ended on that rainy field in New Jersey on May 6, 1937. The future of aviation now belonged to the airplane, faster, smaller, and, crucially, not filled with hydrogen. Epilogue: The Ghost of Lakehurst. Today, the massive hangar at Lakehurst still stands, a cathedral to a dead technology. In the middle of the sandy field where the crash happened, there is a simple memorial, a bronze plaque embedded in a cement block, marking the spot where the Hindenburg's gondola hit the ground. It resembles a tombstone. The Hindenburg remains one of the most iconic disasters of the 20th century, mentioned in the same breath as the Titanic. Like the Titanic, it was a symbol of human arrogance, a belief that we could conquer nature with sheer engineering size. And like the Titanic, it was brought down by a simple, fatal flaw that no one wanted to acknowledge until it was too late. 70 years later, the cry of Herb Morrison still echoes through history. Oh, the humanity! It serves as an eternal reminder of the day the sky burned and the day the world learned that some dreams are just too dangerous to fly.